Welcome to section 2, where I talk about the relationship between teachers and learners in different adult learning theories. This section is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 looks at the difference between learning and education. Part 2 compares teaching children with teaching adults and explains some key differences. Part 3 explains some basic educational terminology. Let's begin. Part 1. Learning versus education. If it is true that we as a species have always learned for as long as we have existed, and that we keep learning throughout our lives, what does that do to us? Well, every time we learn something, we are affected by it. We change. Learning and change are interconnected and are both a result of the other. Every change demands constant learning. When you work as an adult educator, you may have a very specific task at hand: to teach someone letters, or to reflect together on a piece of art, or something else equally defined. You may be an expert in what you teach, or you may be a beginner. You may have a specific plan, or you may adjust according to the dynamic, expectations and interest of the group or class. What is important here to understand is this. While you teach, you are also setting things in motion, some of which are not even related to the task. I claimed in section 1 that adult education is about empowering people. Empowering here would, for example, mean giving people access to a wider set of choices. But this is not yet learning. This is adult education as a tool. To become learning, it must result in some sort of action, concrete or mental. It needs to help facilitate change. As adult educators, we only have limited control over that change, and that is okay. I know it may feel a bit scary to accept that you are not in control. As a teacher, as an expert, as a leader of a group, it is natural to want to be in control, to be the authority. Actually, much education is built on that very premise, and that's also part of the problem with education, in my opinion. I will come back to that. Here is why I think giving up control matters to adult educators. The foundation for what we do must be built on trust. Trust in people, trust in the process, trust in the power learning has to facilitate change. In my experience, this is the path that leads to that change and then to empowerment, meaning adult education, adult learning, becomes bigger than a way to teach adults to read and write, for example. Does learning then accumulate? Yes, it seems fair to claim that we know more than our parents, and this increase in knowledge is constant. Or at least we have access to more and more information. At the same time, we are constantly forgetting things. I think this is fortunate, as our heads might explode if we were to include all new learning and the learning of previous generations, and still try to be able to function, make decisions and act. We have actually become rather good over the years and millennia to sift through a lot of information, to select and to remove. Apart from everything else we do as adult educators, helping people to discern what is relevant information, to be able to select, deselect and to reflect on the learning process is very valuable. And I would even claim something that is often overlooked or not considered very valuable. Learning, then, becomes a process on many levels, seen this way. We cannot and will not go deeper into those processes here and now, but the reading material for this section offers you plenty of entry points when you want to understand more about the many-layered process that we call learning. Here I will just repeat that learning can be defined as an activity that leads to change. Where does that put education? I started this part by promising I would talk about learning versus education. I do not think the difference is a semantic one only. That is to say, I think the concept of learning and the concept of education lead to different results. We are often a bit sloppy in our use of language. It is common to hear the words education and learning used as if they were the same thing, and I do this myself from time to time, and must remind myself not to do so. But why do we mix these terms? I think it is partly due to history. In the history of education, learning is always seen through the prism of teaching and schools, the characteristics of pedagogy. For many people, when they talk about learning, what they really mean is education. To make this very simple, education is a formally structured and hierarchically ordered process by a teacher with the aim of achieving a diploma or grades. It usually takes place in a classroom and is usually monitored through tests and exams. It follows a curricula, and the process is highly formalized. Education, then, is a narrower term than learning. Not all learning that takes place as education, but all education presupposes learning. Learning as a term includes formal and non-formal education and informal learning. Education is for the most part formal, although some non-formal education also exists. Let's now have a closer look at these different types of learning and education. Formal education. As the name suggests, this is the typical classical type of education. We are talking about a hierarchically structured and chronologically ordered system of education institutions, starting from elementary education all the way through university. In French educational literature, for example, formal education is seen as an educational activity in the framework of schools. I think you get the picture. This is more or less the same all over the globe. Formal education nowadays is criticized a lot for its rigidity, where the teacher is an all-knowing authority and the student plays the part of a passive recipient of knowledge. Those working with formal education have spent a lot of effort to modernize it, because there really is no reason why formal education must be stuck in old teaching models. At the same time, the system is rigid and change is very slow, because as a teacher, it is comfortable to be in a position of power and control. So many are of course unwilling to challenge this status quo. And decision makers, unsure about how to measure success or learning outcomes, may also be tempted to stick with what is tested and known. Those in favor of modernization will argue that active learning methods and techniques, as well as including more ICT in the teaching process, creates better outcomes. How are things where you live and work? Non-formal learning. As the name implies, non-formal education is less formalized. It can be defined as a less structured educational activity, usually oriented towards obtaining skills, flexible in the time frame, and oriented towards achieving learning goals. If you watched my personal introduction, you may remember I explained the proverb, "A beloved child has many names." Because of its nature and the fact that non-formal education exists everywhere on planet Earth, the description and scope varies depending on where you are and who you are. This is true even within a country. In Finland, my country, we have not been able to agree on a single uniform description, and we embrace that multitude, make it into a strength. It simply is so rich it cannot be easily labeled. For the same reason, non-formal education may be met with skepticism by many. We as adult educators need to be prepared for that and to figure out a way to have that discussion. Some terms used in andragogic literature to describe non-formal education are non-conventional education, non-traditional education, out-of-school education, training. One thing then to keep in mind is non-formal education is diverse and hard to pinpoint. This type of education is usually organized. You can think of it as a systematic educational activity that helps adults in work, social activities, and individual growth. Non-formal education is useful and often effective because it is based on individual learning needs and the learners. This type of education is characterized by using different teaching methods and techniques, which are often innovative and in most cases use the andragogic approach. This means non-formal adult education is oriented towards the subject and process of learning and not, as in the pedagogical approach, oriented solely towards the content of learning. I will come back to those distinctions in part 2. Now, what type of non-formal adult education takes place where you live? Have you attended some non-formal education? I try to be an active learner when I have the time and energy, because I think the best way to understand learners is to be one yourself. Finally, informal learning. Earlier in this series of lectures, I made the claim that as humans we have always learned. I also said some of the oldest surviving thoughts and learning stems from the Greeks. I claim that learning is something inherent in humans, part of our DNA if you want. The majority of that learning is, and has always been, informal. Informal learning is every non-planned, accidental and non-organized learning by which we obtain knowledge, skills and attitudes throughout experiential learning in everyday life. In andragogical literature, informal learning is usually defined as a lifelong process in which individuals obtain attitudes, skills and knowledge from everyday experience and educational influence from the individuals. Sometimes we call this spontaneous learning, accidental learning, casual learning. In all of these names, we emphasize the non-planned situation and circumstantial aspect of learning. There, now you know some of the basics. I guess you recognized some or maybe several of the terms I used. Which ones are the closest to your heart and why? What type of learner are you? What informal learning situations can you remember from your life? By reflecting on these things, you will become a better teacher, understanding that we are all learners and we all need to be. This is the end of part 1. Before you move on to part 2, where we look at the similarities and differences between teaching children and teaching adults, have a look at the task sheet for this section and go through at least one of the tasks. I say this as I think it is very important to reflect between the sessions and to connect what I talk about here to your own life, experience and understanding.